My name is Jake Thompson, and I've served in the U.S. Army for over a decade. I've been through tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, seen my share of combat, and lost good friends along the way, but nothing could prepare me for what I encountered in a remote forest in Eastern Europe. It was late autumn, 2017, when our unit was deployed for a joint training exercise with NATO allies. We were sent to a dense forest region, notorious for its thick fog and harsh conditions. The locals called it the Silent Forest, and they had good reason for it. The place was eerily quiet, as if the wildlife itself had abandoned it. We set up camp and began our drills. The first few days went smoothly. We practiced maneuvers, conducted reconnaissance missions, and carried out survival training. But as the days went by, strange things started happening. One night, while on guard duty, I heard whispers. They were faint, almost like a distant conversation, but there was no one around. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on me. The next night the whispers returned, only this time they were clearer. I could make out words, but they were in a language I didn't understand. My buddy, Private Anderson, was also on guard duty that night. I asked him if he heard the whispers too. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, man. I thought it was just me. This place is giving me the creeps." The following day, we reported the incident to our commanding officer, Captain Miller. He told us to stay alert but didn't seem overly concerned. "This forest has a history of unsettling stories," he said. "But we're here to do a job. Keep your head straight." That night, I decided to set up a recorder to capture the whispers. What I heard the next morning sent chills down my spine. The whispers were louder, and they seemed to be chanting something. I played the recording for Captain Miller. He listened intently, his expression growing serious. "We need to investigate this," he said. He ordered a small team, including Anderson and me, to scout the area where the whispers seemed to be coming from. We trekked deeper into the forest, following the sound of the whispers. As we moved further away from camp, the forest grew denser and the fog thicker. The whispers grew louder, and soon we stumbled upon an old, abandoned village. The buildings were decrepit, and it looked like no one had lived there for decades. We split up to search the village. I entered what seemed to be an old chapel. Inside I found strange symbols carved into the walls and remnants of old, burnt candles. The air was thick with an unexplainable sense of dread. As I turned to leave, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. I ran out of the chapel, my heart pounding. Anderson and the others were waiting for me outside. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "This place isn't right." As we made our way back to camp, the whispers grew louder and more aggressive. They seemed to follow us, echoing through the trees. We picked up the pace, almost running by the time we reached the edge of the village. Back at camp, we reported our findings to Captain Miller. He listened, his face grim. "We're pulling out," he said. "This exercise is over." We packed up quickly, eager to leave the silent forest behind. As we drove away, the whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Months later, I did some research on the forest. I discovered that during World War II, the area had been the site of brutal massacres. The village we found was rumored to be cursed, its inhabitants believed to be trapped between worlds, forever whispering their anguish. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced in that forest. The whispers, the cold touch, the symbols, all of it haunts me. I faced many dangers in my military career, but nothing compares to the terror of the silent forest. My name is Sergeant Lucas Hernandez, and I've served in the U.S. Army for over 15 years. I've been stationed in various parts of the world, but the most terrifying experience I had was during a peacekeeping mission in Eastern Europe. It was early 2019 when we were sent to a remote region to monitor a ceasefire agreement. Our base of operations was an old, abandoned bunker from the Cold War era. The locals called it the Black Bunker, and there were many stories about strange occurrences and disappearances. We arrived at the bunker and immediately set to work. The place was cold, dark, and damp. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on us. We set up our equipment and began our mission. The first few days were uneventful. We conducted patrols, monitored communications, and maintained a presence in the area. But as time went on, we started noticing odd things. Equipment would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. We heard footsteps in the corridors, but when we investigated, there was no one there. One night, while on patrol inside the bunker, I heard a low humming sound. It was coming from one of the deeper levels, an area we hadn't explored yet. I radioed for backup, and soon a small team, including my friend Corporal Davis, joined me. We descended into the lower levels, the humming growing louder. The air grew colder, and an oppressive feeling weighed down on us. As we turned a corner, we saw a faint light coming from an old control room. Inside, we found a bank of monitors, all displaying static, except for one. The working monitor showed a grainy image of a man in a military uniform. He was staring directly at the camera, his eyes hollow and empty. As we watched, he raised a finger to his lips, as if telling us to be quiet. Then the screen went black. We searched the room but found no evidence of recent activity. It was as if the man had been a ghost, an echo from the past. We returned to the main level and reported our findings. Our commanding officer, Lieutenant Carter, decided to investigate further. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. We heard voices in the walls, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The humming sound persisted, and some of the men reported seeing shadowy figures in the corridors. One night, Davis woke me up, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Lucas, I saw him," he said. "The man from the monitor. He was standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me." I tried to reassure him, but deep down I felt the same fear. Something was wrong with the bunker, something beyond our understanding. We decided to set up a watch rotation, keeping an eye on each other during the night. But the feeling of dread only grew. Men who had served in combat zones and faced death without flinching were now scared to be alone in their bunks. Then one night it happened. The humming grew louder, resonating through the entire bunker. The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled for our flashlights and weapons, ready for anything. As we gathered in the main corridor, the air grew colder, and we saw our breath misting in the air. The humming was almost deafening now, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. Suddenly, the figure from the monitor appeared at the end of the corridor. He was shrouded in shadows, but we could see his hollow eyes and the faint outline of his uniform. He raised a hand, pointing directly at us. "Get out," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the bunker. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, tripping over each other in our haste to escape. As we burst out into the open air, the bunker fell silent, the oppressive feeling lifting. We radioed for immediate extraction, and within hours we were on our way back to our main base. We reported everything to our superiors, but they dismissed it as stress and fatigue. But we knew what we had experienced was real. Years later, I still think about the Black Bunker. I researched its history and found that it had been the site of secret experiments during the Cold War. Many soldiers had died there, their bodies never recovered. Some say their spirits still haunt the place, trapped in a perpetual state of torment. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for sure: I'll never set foot in that bunker again. Some things are better left undisturbed, and the Black Bunker is one of them. I'm Private First Class Emily Carter, and I've been in the U.S. Army for 5 years. My story takes place in a remote outpost in the Middle East. a place that seemed to be forgotten by the rest of the world. It was late 2020, and our mission was to monitor insurgent activity and provide support to local forces. The outpost was small, barely more than a few buildings surrounded by high walls. The desert stretched out for miles in every direction, an endless sea of sand and rock. The locals called the place the Cursed Outpost, and they avoided it as much as possible. Our first few weeks were uneventful. We conducted patrols, maintained equipment, and tried to keep ourselves occupied. But as time went on, strange things began to happen. One night, while on watch, I saw something move in the distance. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I focused I realized it was a figure, standing motionless on a nearby dune. I called it in, but by the time backup arrived, the figure was gone. The next day I mentioned it to Sergeant Collins. He gave me a knowing look and said, "You saw the Watcher. You're not the first." I asked him what he meant, and he told me that previous units stationed at the outpost had reported seeing the same figure. Some said it was a ghost, others thought it was an insurgent scout, but no one had ever gotten close enough to find out. As the days went by, the sightings became more frequent. The figure would appear at different times of the day, always standing on the same dune, always watching. We tried to approach it, but it would vanish before we got too close. One night, the entire outpost was awakened by a loud, piercing scream. We rushed out of our barracks, weapons at the ready, but found nothing. The scream had come from outside the walls, but there was no sign of anyone. The following night, it happened again. This time we saw the figure standing on the dune, and the scream seemed to come from its direction. It was a blood-curdling sound, filled with pain and fear. We were on edge, our nerves frayed. Sergeant Collins decided to set up a watch rotation specifically to monitor the dune. I was paired with Private Ramirez, a tough-as-nails soldier who had seen his share of combat. We took our positions and waited. The desert was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind. Hours passed, and just as we were about to switch shifts, the figure appeared. It stood there, silent and unmoving, watching us. Ramirez and I exchanged a look and decided to approach it together. We moved slowly, our weapons at the ready. As we got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure seemed to shimmer, like a mirage. Suddenly the scream pierced the night again, louder and more desperate than before. We froze, our hearts pounding. The figure vanished and the desert fell silent once more. We returned to the outpost, shaken and confused. Over the next few days, more strange occurrences happened. Equipment malfunctioned, radios picked up static and strange voices, and we found footprints in the sand that led nowhere. The final straw came when Private Ramirez disappeared. He was on watch duty, and when his shift ended, he was nowhere to be found. We searched the entire outpost and the surrounding desert, but there was no trace of him. Our commanding officer, Lieutenant Harris, decided it was time to call for extraction. We couldn't stay in the cursed outpost any longer. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The helicopter arrived and we boarded quickly, eager to put the outpost behind us. As we lifted off, I looked back and saw the figure standing on the dune, watching us leave. The scream echoed one last time, fading into the distance. Back at the main base, we reported everything that had happened. Our superiors listened but offered no explanations. The outpost was abandoned, left to the desert and whatever haunted it. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. Some say the outpost was built on ancient burial grounds. Others believe it was cursed by the spirits of those who had died there. Whatever the truth, I know one thing: I'll never forget the Watcher and the screams that still haunt my dreams.